Ralph Rodriguez with Riders Domain. Today we have with us in the studio Dave Moss. Dave has traveled the world helping people understand the proper importance of maintenance. Dave, how often do you come across people who don't know even emergency maintenance for their motorcycles?
It's a great question. I mean, if you look at our cultural heritage, you buy a motorcycle, what's the first thing you do?
You ride it.
Let's go see what it does, which is even worse because you have no clue about that. No matter where I go with military, countries around the world, riders groups, maintenance of a motorcycle is something that is in a book.
Right.
And they follow the book, and that's supposed to be a cure-all for everything. And all that philosophy comes from having a car. You follow the book. You might push it a little. Well, you'll push it with the bike too. So there's a symbiosis there in philosophy based on cars, which is the predominance of our culture. And unfortunately, motorcycles are not cars. The maintenance on a motorcycle is, I'd probably say 5 times more important in much shorter intervals, because we only have 2 wheels. And we generate a lot of heat because we don't have 4 brakes. And we wear through things faster because they're much more powerful. And our brake fluid boils more often because we tend to stop quicker. So the maintenance side, people really don't have a firm understanding of why a motorcycle requires more maintenance than even the book would suggest.
What's basic maintenance? If somebody needed to do just the basic maintenance, what would it be? What would it entail?
So brake fluid is good for 90 days, and then it absorbs water. So brake fluid is $10 to $15.
Right.
Every 90 days, is it worth changing that because we depend on our front brakes so much?
What's the importance of that? I mean, it's what does the water do to that? I mean,
everybody's unfortunately had brake fade where it keeps coming further and further back to the reservoir. And if unfortunately here, this one's cast and so is the Yamaha. You will see, if you have a remote reservoir, that black rubber piece inside that's supposed to try and keep water out gets sucked out.
Yeah.
So brake fade, you grabbing more and more braking force means there's more and more water in the line. So at $10 to $15 for a bottle of brake fluid, would you bleed your brakes more often because you depend on the front brakes so much that every time you brake, it does the same thing, so you learn your braking power and how much you need to stop, so in a crisis, it doesn't go to the bar.
So if I use my rear brake twice as much as I use my front brake, should I be changing my rear brake oil, or excuse me, my rear brake fluid more often than my front brakes?
If 90 days is your minimum and you cook the rear brake all the time, there's a degree of common sense or logic depending on whether you're right or left brained as to, that's a rhetorical statement, sir.
Awesome.
So yes, of course.
Aside from motorcycle racers, who should have their suspension tuned?
There isn't a person on the planet that owns a motorcycle that should not get it set up to them. Period, end of story, from the very first moment they pick up the bike. When I was the general manager of a Yamaha store in the Bay Area, you were not allowed to leave with your new motorcycle or used new motorcycle until I set it up for you. Under no circumstances were you allowed to pay for any bling until such time as we had made sure the motorcycle fit you properly. Then the bling you purchased was needed. Some bikes are adjustable, some bikes are not. Some bikes have limited adjustments, some bikes have a lot. So when you buy a bike, just think within our own population here in the US, from 5 feet to 7 feet, and weights from 100 pounds to 300 pounds without carrying a passenger. This is supposed to cope with all of that. Right. It is not a car. A car copes with 1,000 pounds or 200 pounds.
Right.
A motorcycle has a weight limit between rider and passenger. Well, what if a solo person at 250 pounds is already over the limit for the suspension and they bought it brand new? and then they sit on it and the rear suspension does this. Nobody ever checks that. They just get on the bike and ride it.
That's right.
And it's a cultural change we need to make.
And you're passionate about this. You're passionate about this because you've seen what can happen if people don't do the suspension, don't do their maintenance.
Yeah, my mission is to save a life every day through information, education, and the online resources I provide. Because people get hurt. If you sit on the bike and you compress the seat foam more than the suspension, don't be complaining when your urine is red. Really? And if you sit on a bike and you crush the suspension because you're way too heavy, it's going to beat the living daylights out of you.
Right.
In a straight line, is that okay? No. When we go too lean, and everything about why we ride the bikes is corners, you have nothing left, because as you corner, the bike gets crushed with centrifugal force.
Right.
The only suspension you got left is your tires.
Well, and as it gets crushed, it's got to go somewhere else, right? It's got to evaporate that compression, and that means
the tire folds. 90% of all fatalities in the world, because I study this in every country I go to, are from loss of control going into the corner. Do you think that bike had ever been set up for that person before? I reached maybe 2 million people last year. How many riders do we have in this country?
a lot more than that.
It's a scratch. And so if people understand and realize that the cost of purchase of a motorcycle also involves the cost of making it right for you before you ride it, that's a much more appropriate position to have. Because at least then when you ride the bike, you are centered instead of off-center. These handlebars are not centered.
Got it.
90% of handlebars can be moved forwards and backwards this way or this way. Put them where you want them. If they don't work, get another handlebar. Look how much we have in the aftermarket.
Right.
You have no excuses. None.
None. All right, Dave, so can you help me set this up for me?
We can take a look at what we've got first.
All right. Well, explain to me what you see when you look at this bike.
So one of the first things, if you're going to go buy a bike, is obviously to sit the person on the bike and see how they fit, right? Do you believe that, for example, that gap from there to there is the same on every motorcycle worldwide? So whose shoe size is that for? Let's start there on the very simplest of things.
I would say yes, but I know I'm wrong.
It's not a case of you're wrong. It might fit you, it might not. So the process here is not projection, it's discovery. So if you are a glass half empty individual, nothing's ever going to be right. I don't have the time of day for you. Get on foot patrol. If you are a glass half full and you're excited about the prospects of having a motorcycle, let's go discover what works and what doesn't. And from there, in taking a look at this, if this Aprilia 900 is in your list, what's it going to do to make it right for you?
Right.
So first thing, without even doing anything of the motorcycle, is can you pick the back of the bike up?
So,
a tiny bit. Why is that important? Well, when you hit a bump, if there's no dead space, what happens to you?
Oh.
You're out of the seat. So the other part that's really important here, what happens to metal when it gets hot? It expands.
Right.
This tiny bit we've got here is going to be consumed. So as soon as you sit on this bike and that shock gets hot, you're the second person on a trampoline. See ya! And every single bump you go over is going to pop you out of the seat that way. Pain in the bum when we're going straight. Nightmare when we're here because all the bike wants to do is push you forward. What does that do to the front tire?
It puts more pressure on the tires.
Right.
That's where you get push, right?
Yeah. And all we've done is this so far. So right now that shock is too stiff as it sits on the showroom floor, and when it gets hot, all that static sag's gone. So that's the first observation.
So that was really interesting. I mean, I knew that you had to change your oil and you had to check your tire pressures and clean your chain, things like that. But I had no idea that you needed to change your brake fluid every 90 days.
Some people treat their motorcycles like cars, and they just take it in, get gas, drive it around, take it in, get gas, drive it around.
Yeah.
Motorcycles, like Dave says, 2 wheels, more moving parts. We got to make sure that it's in top shape, because these can be accidents waiting to happen if you don't maintain your bike.
Yeah, absolutely. And that bit about water getting in there and brake fade, it's, I mean, gosh, you don't want to mess with that.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah. We want to hear from you guys too. Are there maintenance tips that you've got that aren't in the book? If so, leave us a comment and tell us all about it. It was also really interesting to learn that bit about static sag. I think Dave's got a lot more to tell us, and I'm looking forward to see what he has to say next.
He's going to blow your mind.